Welcome to the Circular Economía. I'm Miquel Naval, I'm the director of the Circular Economía. For the Cercle, it's really I would say, a honor and a privilege to host this prize-giving ceremony of the, I understand it's our 9th edition of the Calvó-Armengol Prize. Since most of the faces that I see, I'm not very familiar. I understand that for you probably is the first time that you're here at the Cercle. So allow me to give you a very short introduction on our institution, because I think it might be useful. Let me say that we are. I like to say that we are a strange institution, in the sense that we are quite unique, quite rare. There are not very similar institutions. I would say in other countries. Some people believe that the Circular Economía is a lobby, is a business organization. We are not a business organization. It's true that among our members we have many people who are businessmen, but we are not a business organization. Some people think we are a think tank. It's true that among our members we have people that belong to academia, and we, on a regular basis, we produce some position papers, but we are not, strictly speaking, a think tank. What we are is, I would say, it's an institution that tries to foster or promote public debate, public discussion on economic, social, or political issues that are relevant for the economic, social, and political progress of Spain and of Europe. We are an institution that was established in the mid-1950s, so we are almost 75 years old, to really promote the modernization of Spain. Spain in the 1950s was a very gray country. We were in the middle of a terrible dictatorship. Economically, we were an autarkic country. So this institution was established by some very young people, some businessmen, that wanted to promote the discussion, the public debate on how to modernize Spain economically and politically, and how to work to integrate Spain in Europe, in the European communities that were starting to be that were funded in the late 1950s. Luckily, today Spain is a democracy. Spain is a fully integrated country in the European Union. But still, many of the issues that were relevant at that moment in the mid-50s are relevant today in a very different context. No? What we did, we have today around 1,400 members, and we organize events on a regular basis in this room on many different issues. And we have a very big event that took place last week. In the context of this event, we give a prize. We also have our own prize. It's called the Circular Economía European Construction Prize. It's a prize that probably you have seen upstairs. The recipients of this prize have been Mario Draghi, have been Ursula von der Leyen, have been other very, very relevant people. Last week, the recipient of the prize was Martin Wolf. This is the sort of issues and initiatives that we do. As I said before, for us it's a privilege to host this prize-giving ceremony, to have with us Mr. Johannes Stroebel. That he's I understand German, but I've been very surprised by his British accent, because it's really like as if he were a native. So I understand that now Johan will introduce us to the awardee, and then we will proceed with the ceremony. So thank you very much. Welcome out to the Cercle, and please, Joan, the floor is yours.
So welcome everyone to this Calvó-Armengol International Prize ceremony and speech, where we're actually gonna be delighted to listen to a summary of your research. Let me just introduce Johannes Stroebel briefly. So he's the David S. Loeb Professor of Finance at the Stern School of Business at NYU. He received his PhD from Stanford University and has been the recipient of other awards, such as the Fisher Black Prize from the American Finance Association, a Sloan Research Fellowship, and a Carnegie Fellowship. Johannes' research, it's actually very, very interesting. So I strongly recommend you to go into his website and actually read the papers. He has made pioneering contributions to our understanding of how social networks, beliefs, and interactions shape economic and financial outcomes. Something that's been pretty central has been to show how social connections influence individual expectations and decisions. For example, he has documented that people's house price beliefs and home buying behavior are shaped by experiences of their friends, and that peer interactions affect mortgage choices and even responses to public health shocks, like the one we experienced during COVID-19. One of actually very cool and interesting contributions of Stroebel is the construction and public release. Actually, you can go online and play with that data on the social connectedness connectedness index, which is a very impressive measure on how people are connected to their friends in a geographic from a geographic point of view, right? And we'll have many maps and in detail explanations about how we can use Facebook data to really understand social connections and why is it that some locations are more connected to some other locations. What is the history behind some of the facts are long are facts that come from like long ago. Some are more recent facts, right? And so it gives us a richness of understanding of social connections that really we didn't have until his work. Stroebel's papers also include his work for nature that has transformed our understanding of social capital and upward mobility. I think that that's also fascinating work. It turns out that being connected to rich people is important both to poor and rich people, individuals, but that it's particularly important for poor individuals, right? And so understanding what forms this social connectedness, these social connections, and how these then translates into upward mobility, I think it's a fascinating piece of what he's going to be talking about. He's done amazing work, very data intensive, very empirically driven, but inspired by many great network theorists and a broader range of theory and applied work. So I think it's really a privilege and an honor to have him here and to give him the space to give us a glimpse of the many amazing papers that he's written. Thank you.
Just thank you so much, John, for the really kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. And as was already mentioned, it's not that often that you get to go head to head with the Pope on an event. And so thank you, everybody, for coming here. It's a real honor to be able to talk to you all at an event that was established in honor of, in memory of, and in celebration of Tony Calvó-Armengol, who was really one of the true intellectual giants in the network space. And so what I want to start out by doing is give you guys a glimpse into how Tony transformed the way I think about how the economy works and the way many of us who are working in this space think about how the economy works. And then I'm going to talk about some of my own research, some of the most recent research. In fact, it's going to be a paper I'm going to present for the very first time today that's very much inspired by what we could learn from Tony's work. But let's start out by, remembering his contributions. Sometimes when the contributions are very seminal, it almost feels like, we always knew this, right? Because once you make something an obvious point for the first time, it feels like, it almost feels like, did this point need to be made? Wasn't this obvious all along? And I think, sometimes looking back at the history of economic thought, you realize some of these points weren't obvious until they were made for the first time. And so Tony's contribution were really to place economic interactions in a social context and realizing that by doing so, you could yield a whole range of new and deep economic insight, and that really it's the structure of social connections, social relations, who is connected to whom, who's friends with whom, that's a key economic object. And so, many of his papers featured those insights. This is one of the most famous ones with Matt Jackson, a co-author that Tony and I share, and that has shared with me many of his experiences with him. Studying how social networks affect inequality in employment. But this is really, a theme that you could see throughout the published research of Tony's over the years. So here's a very simple way that I would summarize his views. Here's all of us humans, and most of our economic models don't really take a strong stand about how potentially the connections between us are important in shaping economic insights. And so if you want to abstract to the most simple way, what Tony and his co-authors brought to economic theory, and as we'll talk about also to empirical work in economics, was really to force us to take serious these relations between individuals. Our friends, our networks, they shape what information we have access to. They shape what we believe. They shape our aspirations. They shape whom we trust. They shape access to resources such as job opportunities and so on. And ignoring those networks will put us at a distinct disadvantage in an attempt to try and understand the real world around us. How can we understand the real world around us if so much of it depends on networks, if we don't take those networks serious? But beyond just drawing lines between people, one of the things that Tony's work really highlighted to me, and this is sort of the starting point for the work I'm going to be talking about in a bit, is that it didn't just matter how many friends people had, but what was truly important is in sort of the language of the network theories, the identity of the nodes, right? That it didn't just matter how many friends you had, but in this specific case, if you were a low-income individual, the network, the friendship link that might be the most valuable to you might be that network link to someone who's higher income, because maybe that person would be particularly able to provide you information or aspiration or some of these other mechanisms. And as John mentioned, it's quite natural then to think that the structure of networks would influence a lot of things, including, and you mentioned this, upward income mobility, right? The extent to which someone who grows up in a poor household has the ability in the next generation to rise up in the income distribution, that might well be affected by the structure of the networks they have. And so, these theoretical insights, they had a huge influence on my own research agenda, on the way that I approach my research. And as John mentioned, I'm not a smart theorist, I'm an empiricist. So my research agenda is not to try and sort of take these theory models and develop them further. I generally have to admit I can't do that. I don't understand the math behind it. But my research agenda has really been to try and make these networks observable, right? To try and bring data to the table, to try and see, can we test these theories? Can we try and see, where the networks are strong and where they're weak, and then trying to start to think, what can we do to strengthen the networks? What can we try and do to build the networks that really drive, some of these outcomes that we care about? And so what I want to do for the rest of today's talk is to present a new piece of work called Social Capital Around the World, where we try and measure the structure of these networks. Really trying to be as global as one can be, trying to figure out, how do networks look different across continents, across countries, within countries, across cities, and so on. This is work with, my colleague Teresa Kuchler at NYU, my colleague and longtime friend Mike Bailey, who used to be at Facebook, Drew Johnston, who's at OpenAI now, used to also be at Facebook, and you'll guess why it's helpful to have co-authors at Facebook, and then two former pre-docs of mine, Ayush and Manas. So what we try and do in this work is to speak to, a long-standing debate that was had both in economics, but actually primarily in sociology, on the determinants and the effects of, a pretty broad concept that people refer to as social capital. You've probably all heard someone use the term social capital at one point or another. And what's actually interesting is that social capital means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It does not have a clear definition. And when you look in the sociology literature, you will find people refer to a whole range of aspects of social life as social capital. But a recent focus of ours has been on one aspect of social capital that we call economic connectedness. And what we mean by economic connectedness, I'm going to give you a formal definition in a bit because this is actually, an academic lecture. But at a high level, it's just the extent to which rich and poor people in a society are connected. That is an aspect of social capital of a society. And there's an interest in trying to understand where that's high and where that's low, why it's high somewhere and low somewhere else, and why that might matter for the types of outcomes that we care about. And so, understanding that sort of these types of what you might sometimes call bridging social capital, so it's networks that bridge different people. It's important, again, has been in the sociology literature for a long time. Glenn Loury wrote a paper in 1978, a theory paper, again, making that point.
But empirical work has really been largely constrained by limited data on social networks, and in particular, globally comparable data on social networks. And so, again, what my research has been doing and what we're going to be using in this paper here is to work with social network data from Facebook. We've worked with Facebook data for the better part of a decade. This is really, in some sense, the most ambitious in terms of its scale. So here we work with friendship data among 2.1 billion Facebook users across 183 countries, almost 600 billion friendship links between them. And we're going to try and use them to describe the structure of social networks around the world. I'll show you Barcelona, I'll show you Andorra, I'll show you Madrid. You can see everything. And it's going to start bringing up questions about what it is that we can all do to start and shape the networks around us in important ways. So the paper has 3 parts. The first one is purely a measurement bit. Right? I'm going to describe to you how we measure economic connectedness around the world. Using that to describe how cross-class friendships vary across places. The second part is trying to figure out, because you'll see in some places rich and poor are very connected, and in others barely at all. I'm going to figure out 4 things that drive this. And this is not the totality of things that drive variation in social network. In fact, I think we're just scratching the surface, which is why sometime in the fall we'll be releasing all of the data I'm going to show you today, so you can dig into your country and your neighborhood, and you can start understanding what drives the networks where you live. But we found 4 different things. We're going to look at the role of cities. Are cities a good or a bad place to form cross-class connections? Urban theory is not clear about this. There's some urban theory, Jane Jacobs and so on, as well, that suggests, cities are great. Everybody comes together and mixes, the Jane Jacobs called the sidewalk ballet. Everybody meets everyone, And then there's people who say, no, actually cities might not be great places to form cross-class things. We'll be able to test this. We'll see. Everyone can make a prediction in their mind now, commit now, and then we'll see who's right and who's wrong. Multidimensional sorting. Multidimensional sorting, I'm going to be very explicit about. But I'm going to show you that in places where the rich and poor speak different languages, there's going to be many few cross-class links. That's not that surprising, but it matters. And it matters particularly in multilingual cities like the one we're in. Right? So I'm going to show you that. Inequality. When the rich and the poor are far apart in terms of their absolute lifestyles, it's harder for them to make friends. Again, maybe not that surprising, but it is perhaps another reason why inequality is problematic. Sometimes we think, well, we're willing to accept inequality if it just comes with intergenerational mobility, right? Rich and poor is fine if the rich are a lot richer than the poor, as long as every generation we mix it up. There's a lot of belief in that. What I'm going to show you is there's a problem with that link, because a lot of inequality will reduce cross-class links, and I'll also show you in the very last bit that places where we have no cross-class links has no intergenerational mobility, right? So those are the last bit of what I'm going to talk about. How does economic connectedness relate to broader socioeconomic outcomes? So I'm going to go back to upward income mobility. This was the first outcome we studied just in the United States. I'm going to try and see how that looks across countries. But now that we have this globally, we can start looking at outcomes that go beyond just upward mobility. We can start looking at something like trust, which varies a lot across countries. And we can see that the structure of network doesn't just affect how easy it is for a poor kid to rise up the income distribution. It affects how much we trust each other in society. It affects how much we believe the democratic process is valuable and important. I'm going to be clear about which set of outcomes here we have clear causal evidence, and which part of the outcomes here we have very strong correlational evidence that's consistent with causal story. But as we all know, clean identification, in particular in cross-country studies, are a little hard. But you know what? I'm beyond caring about identification for a bunch of these things, for the simple reason that I think we've gone too far as a profession to think that you can't learn anything from correlations, right? I sometimes think when you have a correlation that rules in a theory or rules out a theory, that's extremely valuable, even if I don't have clean causal identification. But I'm going to be honest about what I can say with certainty in terms of causal sense, where I'm going to use theory and, an empirical pattern in the data to make statements that I believe are true. The beauty here is you're not my referees, so I can just tell you what I actually believe is going on, rather than what I can prove with, the degree of certainty that you need to get a referee to sign off at the end of the day. Okay, so that's the plan for today, all right? So let's start talk about measuring. Okay. So what are we going to do? We're going to work with data from Facebook. We're going to look at 183 countries and territories in which Facebook's widely available. This is basically everywhere except China and Iran. Everywhere with meaningful population. Those are 2 countries where Facebook's banned. For the core analysis that I'm going to show you, we're going to focus on a subset of 142 countries in which the sample coverage is pretty high and pretty representative. Right? It's going to be some countries where Facebook is legal and accessible, but the share of the population that's on the platform for one reason or another is so selected or so small that I don't want those results to be driving my core messages, so I'm going to drop them. I could keep them in, and nothing of what I'm going to tell you today would be affected by that. But I'm going to keep those out. So within those countries, what are we going to do? We're going to look at active users. So those are people who've used the platform in the last 30 days, between 18 and 65 years old. And we're going to look at people that have, at least 25% of the friends in the country they live. So we're going to exclude people who just arrived in the country. So the very recent immigrants in the country, we're going to drop them. Right? That gives us 2.1 billion users who have these 600 billion friendships between them. So what we then need to do in order to figure out how much rich and poor people in a country connected, you have to come up with a proxy of who's rich and who's poor in each country. Right? So how do we do that? So we start out by running a survey. In fact, Facebook ran a survey, not us. Facebook ran a survey in the news feeds of users from 64 different countries, 73,000 users. And we ask in that survey components of the SES. So here's how the survey looked. This is how it looked in the United States. Right? So you ask people what household income was. And then we also ask a little bit about access to resources, right? Questions like, I own a smartphone. I flew on a plane last year. I have enough savings to cover, 3 months of expenses. In developing countries, we also ask, I have access to running water. I have access to reliable electricity. Questions like that. So, we vary the questions that we ask a little bit by whether or not we're asking in Malawi or the United States, because, asking in Malawi, if they own stocks and bonds is not probably the most relevant metric, and asking in the United States if you've run electricity, hopefully is not that binding for most people, though, increasingly maybe so. And then we use those and basically construct an SES index for each of these survey responses. And what we then do is we, in a second step, train a machine learning model with characteristics that we observe for every one of these 2.1 billion people in our sample. We train a model to predict this SES index that we get. What are sort of features that go into that model? It's going to be some things that use a self-report, like their education level. It's going to be some things that are collected in the normal course of interacting with Facebook, like the phone you use to log in. How often you buy a new phone. Do you have an expensive phone? That's pretty informative. In many places, the phone carrier you have. And then also things like the location where you live. And I'm going to bore you. We spent like a year and a half building this model. It works well. I'm just going to leave it at that. We are pretty good based on this, data that we have to predict people's income. We're going to use the model to predict the SES for, the 2.1 billion people in our sample. Again, we validate that against a bunch of external things. It's a pretty good job of doing this. And then lastly, what we do is we're going to rank all users by SES within their country in both code. That's an important thing. When I'm going to talk about rich and poor, for most of what I'm going to talk about, it's going to be the percentile you sit within your country, within your birth code. We obviously know that, people of 45 are richer than people of 25. I don't want to make that comparison. So I'm going to just compare 25-year-olds. And then for now, in order to have something that's meaningful across countries, I'm just going to say you're the poorest 1%, the next poorest 1%, and so on. That's going to be my measure of SES. Okay. I'm going to come back to, things like absolute inequality, as I hinted at before, but for now, that's what we're going to do. Okay. I can build many different SES models. In fact, I can do something. I can literally take the price of your current phone. I don't do any survey. I don't do any machine learning model. I don't need just the price of your current phone. I'm going to construct my measure of economic connectedness, how much people with a cheap phone are connected to people with a rich phone. 0.8, 0.85, 0.9 correlation across space with the more fancy model. So this is not about some sort of magic, some rabbit I'm going to pull out of the hat with the model. Even the most basic data gets you the same patterns, so you don't have to worry about that. What we then do is we're going to use Facebook friendships, and we're going to use them as a measure of real-world economic networks. And I've used this data for long enough, worked with this data for long enough to know that you could eat up an entire talk discussing, oh, your Facebook friends really your real friends. And the point is, obviously not every person you're connected to on Facebook is your real friend. And obviously not every one of your real friends is a Facebook friend. And we all agree on that. That if we're trying to measure networks at global scale, there's nothing like it. There's no alternative. So we can either say, well, you can't do it because it's not perfect. But beyond that, once you start looking at the networks of a city, I don't think any of these things bias cross-sectional comparisons. So to the extent you worry about our Facebook friendships, real friendships, etc., worry about it through the lens of, are any of the messages I'll tell you today going to be affected by that? Not a per se, I added this person once and I've never met them, so you can't do this, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We can do a lot here. In our baseline, I'm going to take every friendship equal. I can focus on your top 10 friends, right? The 10 people you interact with the most on the platform. I can use the top 100 friends. I can look at friendships you formed a long time ago or just the ones you formed in the last year. I can do a lot of different things. Again, none of this matters because we're going to look at patterns at the spatial level, not at the individual level. And I think the cross-sectional variation is essentially the same. Okay. So with that data work done, we can start doing some real economics. We're going to define this object here, which is just the average friend percentile. So I look at a person, I look at all their friends who live in the same country, so we're not ignoring cross-country friendships for now. These are just friendships of people who live in the same country. And then we'll look at the average SES percentile of the people they're friends with. Very straightforward. And what I can then do is I can start to look at how does that average friend percentile vary with someone's own friend percentile. You've seen some of these rank graphs potentially in other settings. Here's one for India. This is the percentile of an Indian in, again, age-adjusted income distribution. And here's the average percentile of the income of their friends. Well, you can see it's a pretty steep upward slope. The poorest Indians have substantially poorer friends than the richest Indian. The relationship is relatively linear. For India, it kind of becomes convex at the very top. The top few percentiles of Indians are completely segregated from the rest of the country. Okay. What I need to do, I can plot a curve like this for every city in the world, for every county in the world, for every country in the world. The problem is I need to find a single number to represent it, or a small number of single objects to represent it. So for a lot of what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a linear approximation to this curve. So I'm going to draw a straight line through, and then I'm going to look at two specific objects, two specific parts of economic connectedness that I care about. The first one is what we're going to call upward EC, or upward economic connectedness. It basically goes to people who are the 25th percentile of their own national income distribution and looks at what the predicted friend percentile is for them. So that's the first object. The second object I'm going to care about is I'm going to call EC divide. What's the EC divide? It's the slope of that line. Right? How different in terms of their income composition are the networks of the rich and the poor people in a location. Right? So those are going to be the two objects. This one here is probably most relevant if you're trying to study absolute outcomes of low income people. You look at the networks of low income people. This one here is probably most relevant when you're trying to look at difference in outcomes between poor and rich. You start looking at the differences in networks between them. And also when you're trying to look at something that I'm going to sort of wishy-washily call here overall social cohesion, and give some more structure to what I mean by that down the road. Okay. So we have these two objects, upward EC and EC divide. So now I can do this for other countries. So this is what the United States looks like. The slope is pretty similar to India, actually. That might be surprising. You might have thought India is maybe more divided than the United States. It's not. The difference actually where the United States comes is which part the convexity comes in, or which part the nonlinearity comes in. In India, it's the top few percent that are most segregated. In the US, it's the bottom few percent that are really separate in terms of their friendship networks from everybody else. Again, those nonlinearities are actually going to be driving anything. We want to ignore them away from my linear approximation. But it's still cool to look at this, and you could think about stories for each of these. What about Denmark? Denmark is probably the flattest line from all of them, right? So the networks in Denmark are much more connected. Rich and poor Danish people, much more connected, except again at the very bottom. I suspect that's to do with immigration. I don't know, but it's a plausible theory here. But these are staggeringly different ways in which the social structure of these countries looks like when you start looking at it through this lens, okay? So this is at the country level. How does it look at the sub-regional level? Now, oh, by the way, you can also do this across regions, right? So this is three different Indian states. What you start seeing when you look across countries, you see it's usually a tilt around P50. Why? Because every country has equally many people at each part of the income distribution. By design, we're ranking people in the national income distribution. When you start looking across space, you're going to get these vertical shifts, right? Bihar is a really poor Indian state. And so even the people who are rich nationally in Bihar have relatively poorer friends. Why? Because you make most of your friends locally. And if you're a rich person in a place where there's generally just other poor people around, your network's going to look a lot poorer than when you're equally rich in a state where there's many more rich people around, right? So once you start looking at subnational variation, you can have vertical shifts of this line. The vertical shifts of this line give you big differences in this upward EC. How connected to rich people, poor people. If you're a poor person in Andhra Pradesh, one of the richest Indian states, you still actually end up having a lot of rich friends because most people around you are rich. If you're a poor person in Bihar, it's much harder because there's many, many fewer rich people around, right? So you can see these vertical shifts once you start looking across countries. Okay, so now let's start looking at some maps. So this is upward EC. How many rich friends do poor people have across European counties? The first thing that will jump out at you here, by the way, are those vertical shifts. If I plotted a map of average incomes, they would look relatively similar, right? It's the poorer parts of Spain, it's the poorer parts of Germany, right? It's the poorer parts of the United Kingdom, right? What's really, now that's not the only thing that's going on. So that's what you can see in this graph here. In this graph here, I'm ranking people by their upward EC. How many rich friends do poor people have? And on this axis here, I'm plotting variation in average incomes. And obviously, the higher the average income, the more rich friends poor people have. But that other component, the EC divide, how steep that line is, still matters. Same average income, very different friendship networks, depending on this EC divide, right? When rich and poor networks in a given place are different. So where are they different? Well, that's in this map here. So this map here gives you EC divides, this steepness of the slope across spaces in Europe. Again, Nordic countries, relatively flat. You know, Austria, Switzerland, relatively flat. Eastern Europe, in particular Romania and Bulgaria, very steep. We'll talk about that is. Catalonia, more red than other parts of Spain. Coast also more red. In Germany, the cities, very red. Right? That starts getting us to thinking about this question, are cities good and bad for rich and poor to integrate? Red here suggests the networks of the rich look very different to the networks of the poor in the cities. Right? And so we can start exploring why that is the case. This is the same map for India. Again, on the left, it just looks like average income in India, for those of you who've ever looked at a map like this. But on the right, you can see big differences in EC divide. Some parts of India, rich and poor, conditional on being there, are much more connected, have much more similar networks than in other parts of India. This is Africa. This is North America. This is South America. And somehow I have to just stop doing maps because each of these maps tells a story. And maps are cool and you can spend a whole weekend going through and like staring at it. But at the end, we need to do a little bit of statistics, again, largely correlations to try and kind of put structure to this map. One more. Middle East and Turkey is super interesting as well. I mean, it's a big country, lots of Facebook usage, lots going on. Okay. Highest EC divides in the world, by the way, Colombia and other parts of South America, in particular that part of South America, Ecuador, Colombia, some of the highest, most divided societies in the world. UAE, right? This was very red. I mean, the absolute numbers here are really high. I rescaled each of these maps to show variation within the continent. If you do a constant map, constant scale across the world, most of Europe is just green, right? So the dividedness of the societies in Europe, except for Romania and Bulgaria, does not approach what you see in South America, what you see in the UAE. UAE, Thailand, Panama, Mexico, Philippines, and the most divided. Some of the lowest ones, the ones we saw in Europe, right? The ones that Europe is probably, Europe and Africa, interestingly, some of the least divided networks, and obviously the places that were greenest within Europe are going to be greenest in the world. About 60% of the cross-region variation I showed you is across countries rather than within them. But if you flip that, 40% of that is within country variation. It's Barcelona versus Madrid, not Spain versus Germany, that's driving it. Right? So we can start understanding that it's not just national policy that's playing a role here. There has to be other things that are going on. And so the large spatial variation that we observe raises two questions, right? What drives the differences that we observe across locations, and what are the consequences on societal outcomes? So let's go about the drivers, determinants of this, right? What are things that are going on? So what we're going to examine correlations between EC and determinants. Each of these correlations has a whole long history of sociological theory that suggests that these things should be mattering. The evidence is correlational, but again, I'm going to argue it's informative, even in the absence of quasi-random variation and stuff. To start out with, if predicted relationships appear consistently across countries and across regions, it supports the theories. If it doesn't, it's going to be hard for the theory to hold up. So at least at a minimum allows us to rule out some theories that predict some relationship here that we just don't end up finding in the data. So we're going to explain these four factors. I've talked about them already. I'll go through them one by one. The four factors we have explain just under 2/3 of all of the global variation in EC divide, in the steepness of this line, right? So there's a lot left unexplained, but we're getting a good chunk of the way there. So let's first talk about the role of cities, because we're in one of the world's greatest cities here. This comes from someone who lives in the world's greatest city, so, this is a real compliment. Does EC divide increase in population density, or does it not? Are cities better places where the rich and the poor have very different networks, or do they not have? As I said, urban theory does not have a clear prediction here, right? So you have, the Jane Jacobs or a lot of Ed Glazer's work is that, look, dense areas create large, diverse social pools. When you walk around Barcelona, in principle, you can meet very rich people and you can meet very poor people. They're all here, right? And so cities, at least in principle, provide the opportunity for cross-class connections. But there's also an argument that says, look, density can cause groups to split off, right? And when groups split off, they often split off in ways that aligns with income. Simple way to picture this. If you're in a small village, there's a single football club. You want to play football, you join that club. You're rich, you're poor, you have no choice. That's where you don't play. If you're in a big city, there's too many people want to play football, just have one club. So you need 2 clubs and 5 clubs and 10 and 20. And immediately there's a club where the rich people end up going, and there's a club where the poor people end up going. And that's not just true for clubs, that's true for schools. That's true for restaurants. That's true for everything, right? So that's Claude Fisher's theory of why actually population density is bad, because it increases the choice set. And in his language, allows for multidimensional matching. It allows you not just to find someone who likes to play football and then you have to accept, quote unquote, that they might be of a different SES. You can find someone who likes to play football and is your same social, and maybe even went, to your same boarding school or whatever else, right? And that allows for more selection. Okay, so let's look at this. We're going to look at a measure of population density that is called effective population density. So it's basically the density experienced by the average person. Here's a cross-country correlation. And what you find is that those places with more population density, in general, they have more divided networks. Rich and poor have very different networks in places, where population density is different. I could plot the same graph within countries. In fact, that's what I'm doing here. I'm showing you a histogram of the within-country correlations across the 183 countries we have in our sample. So this wasn't a cross-country correlation. This shows you that in 95% of countries, the within-country correlation basically goes the same way. It's also positive, right? So it's both across and within-country. Population density leads to more fragmented networks. But what's interesting is this does not necessarily mean that cities are bad for poor people to make rich friends. Because while poor and rich might have very different networks, remember those vertical shifts, cities are also the places where there are generally more rich people around. So I'm showing you this here. This here is a correlation between income and population density across countries. This is a fact that's true in every country. The cities is where people are rich, on average, the countryside not. So you have two forces playing a role. When you're a low-income person, you want to try and figure out, where can I make the most high-income friends? The cities give you more rich people around, but they also have these more fragmented networks. So you have the two forces fighting each other. They pull you in opposite directions. What's interesting is that on balance, the having more rich people around force wins out. So poor people have more rich friends in cities, even though cities are places where the networks of the poor and rich look most different. I got to wrap your head around that a little bit. Right? So cities are not necessarily bad places for poor people to make rich friends, even though the rich in cities are more segregated from the poor. Okay. So it's a bit of a nuanced picture about the role of cities. Right? The exposure part of Glaser and Jane Jacobs is true. Right? And it actually wins over the other force. It's also true that the cities have the most divided networks because, we can have 8 football clubs that all, differ on all dimensions that we care about. Okay. The difference to this is the most extreme cities, places like Bangkok and Mumbai. Even though there's a lot of rich people in Bangkok and Mumbai, they're so segregated from the poor that the poor in Bangkok and Mumbai don't actually have rich friends. But on average, it's true. It's just not in the most segregated cities on the planet. Right? So again, there's a lot of ways that you can split this data and so on. Do that. Second theory, and I picked this one as the last one I want to focus on in a lot of detail before looking at the effects of these networks. Do other social divisions exacerbate EC divide? So there's a theory in sociology has this beautiful term called multidimensional status spaces. Right? It's been around since the late 1970s. What does this mean? It basically says, look, if the rich and poor don't just differ on income, but they also differ on some other central dimension on which we select, it's really hard to form cross-class friendships. Okay. So in the empirical context I'm going to show you, that other dimension is going to be language. If rich and poor don't just have different incomes, but they also speak a different language, it's going to be really, really hard to form cross-class things. In fact, we know there's what we call language homophily. There are few cross-language friendships. We've already seen that there's few cross-class friendships. But if you add up the lack of cross-class and the lack of cross-language friendships, the overall effect of language and class overlapping is bigger than the sum of the two dimensions. Right? That's the sociological theory. So how do we test this? How do I know whether or not in a given place language and income overlap? Well, it's beautiful because I have phenomenal data on what languages people speak. Because Facebook gives you a lot of content in a lot of different languages, potentially, and then it sees which content you interact with. So if you interact with a lot of Catalan content, I know you speak Catalan. If you produce Catalan content, I know you speak Catalan. Right? And so we have for people very detailed information about the languages they speak. So here's an example of, Hindi speakers in India. This is a map of Marathi speakers in India. This is a map of German speakers in Europe, all the way to like the northern Italian province showing up. This is Arabic speakers in Europe. I could just look at language maps all weekend. It's really fascinating in itself. But here, we're just going to use them as an input to construct a metric I'm going to call a linguistic SES divide. So here's the idea. I told you have a good proxy for your income. In each place, say in Barcelona, what I'm going to do is I'm going to regress for every individual who lives in Barcelona their income on dummies for the languages they speak. And then I'm going to look at the R squared. What's the R squared? It basically says how predictive is the language for your income. If I know what languages you speak, how well do I know your income? Higher R squared means language and income are more aligned. Lower R squared means language and income aren't aligned. Language doesn't tell me anything about income. There's 2 reasons it might be low, by the way. One is if everybody speaks the same language. Go to the UK, everyone just speaks English, first order. So it's not really informative about your income. Right? Second thing is, even if people speak different languages, as long as each language group is roughly equally rich, it's still not going to be informative. That's Switzerland. In Switzerland, you tell me you speak French or German, you're all rich, right? So it's not that informative. It has to be a place where there's different languages and the speakers of the different languages also have different income. So that's this linguistic SES divide, right? That metric. And so we can measure that again everywhere in the world. So this is this in India. I'm just going to want to show you in Europe, because here where we are, shows up pretty red, right? So what's going on here? When you look at the data, the Catalan speakers have a different average income than the Spanish speakers. And so if I know that you interact with content on Catalan, I know you speak Catalan, that's pretty informative about your income, okay? The other parts where this is true is parts of Romania, and then again, the big cities that have seen a lot of immigration. In Berlin, I know you speak Arabic. I can probably guess you're a recent Syrian immigrant, and you're probably going to be relatively poorer, right? So those are also places where you have a lot of language diversity, and the language diversity aligns with something else, okay? So I can do this everywhere, and then I can look at the correlation. And one of the things you see is that the places in the world where language is most predictive of income are also the places in the world where you have a lot of cross-class disconnect, largely the Middle East. If you go to the UAE, tell me you speak Arabic, I know you're rich. You tell me you speak Urdu or Bengali, I know you're probably not, right? And there's also very, very little social connections across those groups, right? Now, what you see here is, this is obviously not the only thing going on. Colombia, pretty monolingual country. Still a lot of EC divide, right? So it's not the only thing going on, but it's a big contributor, right? So what are the other things? Absolute differences in SES. Talked about this already. Gini coefficient. Places that are more unequal have fewer links across class. Why? It kind of makes sense. If the rich and poor have very similar lifestyles, like in Denmark, if you're the 75th or the 25th percentile of the income distribution, your lifestyle isn't that different. Your income isn't that different. 71st versus 25th in Colombia, it's a very, very different lifestyle, right? And so you see, the countries in the world with the most inequality, Colombia and Ecuador, almost no cross-class connection. It makes sense. Lifestyles become so different that the types of settings where you might even meet somebody who's from a different background is going to be very hard. What's the last thing? The last thing, very straightforward, it's residential segregation. We can measure residential segregation everywhere in the world. Obviously, I'm not going to bore you with it, also correlated. So these four things, four factors: inequality, residential segregation, population density, and this linguistic SES divide. And again, together they explain just under 2/3 of the global variation in this. So now I've explained, what about the remaining 40%? Well, what's interesting now is I can plot the residuals. It can be, what are places that have more cross-class links or fewer cross-class links than I would predict given these four factors of what I know about them? That's basically where you would start a research agenda that says, let me find other things that matter. Right, so I can do that. It's interesting, Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe does so much worse than you would predict. One thing that's generally true about these regions is there's a lot of multi-ethnicity. In particular, if you overlaid percentage of the population that's Sinti and Roma, it looked pretty similar map in Eastern Europe as it is here, right? So that might be another dimension beyond language where some other space overlaps with income, inhibiting cross-class connections. This here is the United States. What is here? These are all Indian reservations, right? Again, it's not captured by any of my four factors, but it can matter. You can look at other parts of the world. You can have your own favorite theories, figure out what's going on, okay? But here is where we're now at. Here's what we have to do. We have to try and figure out, besides what drives economic connectedness, but does it matter, right? Does it matter? And so in order to answer that, to answer the consequence of economic connectedness, we're again going to look at a small subset of outcomes, right? We're going to start by looking at intergenerational income mobility. We talked about this before. We look at this because this is where our earlier work started. When we looked at the United States, and in the United States, we found that counties where there were more cross-class connections had more intergeneral mobility. This is a relationship where in ongoing work we show it's causal. I don't have that for you here today, but the correlations we established in that earlier work we can now show are truly causal. So if I changed quasi-randomly your friendship network, I can cause you to have higher upward income mobility. I love this picture here because to me this picture sums up so much of the way that I think Tony looked at the world, right? all his work was about how networks help people, how networks are helpful for people to find jobs, to get education, to move out of poverty. And so when Nature published this earlier piece of work, they put this cover on, which is this network people pulling each other up. And every time I look at this, I'm reminded of that's really at the core of that work, right? The network theory, the nodes, right? They're just a representation of what's going on in the real world. And it's really an opportunity to make people's lives better, these networks. They're not just like some mathematical object, right? So I really love that cover, and I have this on my desk because it reminds me that this is actually, not just theory, and that the ability to now measure it, allows us to bring this to the real world. So why? So first thing we do is we check whether the relationship is specific to the US or whether it exists elsewhere. It exists elsewhere. This is across countries. Countries with more divided networks have lower upward mobility. So what we found across US counties, we find across countries. We look within 16 countries for which we find regional level data of upward mobility. And we look at within Spain. Here is within Spain. In places where poor people have more cross-class connections, more upward mobility in Spain. Okay. Now, one thing you might think for the cross-country connection that I just showed you is you might think, isn't this just what we already know? Don't we know that more inequality leads to less intergenerational mobility? This is the famous Great Gatsby curve, right? That we've all seen so many times, right? That cross-sectional relationship across countries between income mobility and inequality. And didn't I just tell you that inequality was a key driver of these networks? So maybe I'm just picking up inequality again. So what I'm doing here is I'm running a bivariate regression. Again, bivariate regressions don't cleanly identify anything, but they're pretty informative, right? And what this tells me is that once I control for the network, changes in inequality have no effect on upward mobility, right? But when I hold inequality fixed, if I can change the network, I can meaningfully move around upward mobility. Again, this is a causal interpretation on what's a correlation so far. But the Great Gatsby curve has driven so much of policy, so much of this thinking about why is it a problem to have inequality? That one figure, I think, has been so influential that I think realizing that maybe the reason we see the Great Gatsby curve is because of the way that inequality drives networks. Right? Maybe the networks are the mediating factor between the Great Gatsby curve. And so in terms of pop culture references, maybe what we really want is a Goodwill Hunting curve. Remember that movie where, the janitor meets the MIT professor and gets mentored by the MIT professor and gets helped put on a better life? Right? That movie, maybe that's truly what's going on. It's the networks, not the inequality per se, that are the key driving force. Again, more work to be done here. But I think we might be onto something here. Okay. So that's on upward income mobility. I promised one last set of things, which is things like trust, support for democracy, many other things. I'm not going to walk you through each one of them. But what I can tell you is correlationally, societies with more cross-class networks have more trust. They have more confidence in institutions like courts, parliament, the police. They have more pro-social norms. When rich and poor aren't connected, everybody thinks cheating is accepted. Where they're connected, you don't see that. Many other outcomes that we generally think of as good, like maybe viewing democracy as important, right? They all seem to correlate, with the extent of cross-class connectedness, okay? Okay. So where does this lead us? It leads us to this ability from this, what I think pretty, unique data set, billions of people, hundreds of billions of friendship networks, to try and break that down and look at the fabric of society and the extent of social capital, how it varies across space, why it varies across space, and what are the implications of that. And I think trying to figure out what are the next steps here, right? I mean, clearly getting behind mechanisms, figuring out causality are the next steps. So on causality, I teased this already. We have a paper that's going to hopefully come out sometime later in the summer, where at least for the networks, economic mobility relationship, we have research designs where we can now make causal statements that I think we're pretty comfortable with. Why? We have to do more understanding the mechanism. Right? I talked about this, right? It could be trust, it could be information, it could be a lot of things. I don't know what it is. We need to understand this. Why do we need to understand this? Well, first of all, because it might help us figure out whether or not some of these new AI tools that are getting built all around the world might help us substitute for the lack of these relationships. Right? Like if it is largely information, maybe a well-functioning chatbot can provide that for you, to you. Maybe it can. If it's largely about getting you an internship, it probably can't do that. If it's about shaping your aspirations, maybe. I'm not so sure it can't. I have no idea. But once we understand the mechanisms, right? One thing is, let's form more cross-class links. But then in those places where we can't do that, can we substitute for that somehow? Right? And on the information side, you all know the work of, Caroline Hoxby and Sue Dynarski and others who've gone out and basically randomly just provided information to poor kids who did well on the test and said, if you apply to University of Michigan, you will get in and it will be free for you. And they did an RCT. And more people applied and they got in and they went to college. So it does tell you the information is at least part of the story. Right? What are other policy you can do? I mean, there's lots of things you can think about to build these networks. You can think about integrating schools more. Maybe tracking is bad. We see this in the data. Those schools where they have like a track for the smart kids and a track for the less smart kids within the same school generally ends up being a track for the rich kids and a track for the poor kids. And then there's no friendships. Right? School uniforms. When everybody looks the same and you can't tell from the clothes someone's wearing if they're rich or poor, it helps form these friendships. Again, at least in the data. We look at these friendships school by school, and we can see these patterns. Third spaces for interaction. We need public libraries. We need parks. We need places where cities can function, where this whole, sidewalk ballet from Jane Jacobs can actually work, right? Because if all social interaction happened in people's homes, right, those interactions don't work. If the rich people stop using the subway, there's an opportunity for contact gone beyond also their willingness to fund public transit disappears when they're not using it anymore, right? The physical design of buildings. This is something weird. So we saw a school in our data, and the school had, I was talking with Pavel about this the other day. The school had crazy levels of disagreement. There were rich and poor kids in that school, but there were no friendships between them whatsoever. And we're like, what's going on at school? So we dug into that one school. It turns out this school was a merger of two prior schools, right? And what they decided to do in their wisdom is when they merged the school, they had two cafeterias, right? And so what you have in the US, you have these things called free and reduced lunch. So if you're a poor kid, you get free lunch from the government. The government pays for it. But for good reason, the government has very strict regulations about the nutritional content of the food, right? They worry, well, if the school has to provide free lunch for the poor kids, it's just going to be unhealthy food. So they make it really, really complicated, right? So this many calories, this many vegetable, all this stuff. So the school's it's really annoying to have to comply with this. Let's just offer it in one of our two cafeterias so that the other one doesn't have to deal with the regulation. So what happened? There's one cafeteria where the poor kids can go and get free and reduced lunch. Do you think that's the one where the rich kids go? Even if the food's better? No. And so this is what, we read the school student newspaper, and they were describing that exact story. So what the school then subsequently did is they actually worked with an architect, redesigned the school, built a central key cafeteria where everybody went, precisely because they wanted to form these links. Mentorship programs, right? The idea that you can try and find formal mentorship programs, I think, is really important, and we have lots of examples of that working. I think fundamentally what we need to do is once we understand that social capital is crucial, it's crucial for economic outcomes, it's crucial for trust in society, it's crucial for the functioning of our democracy. Once we understand that, it's not here's 5 things to do. It's everything we do should think a little bit about what does this do to our networks? What does this do to our social capital? So I had a suggestion for Teresa the other day. I said to her, and now you hear it too, and so now you can blame each other if it doesn't happen. I said, your next conference, on your app, have a random matching. For 30 minutes, someone randomly matches a name with someone they've never talked to, from a different industry, maybe someone who's not as rich as them, and force them to have coffee for 30 minutes, just once throughout your conference. It's not hard to build. We've built this in places. The feedback is great. People are like, normally I go to conference, I just talk to the same 5 people over and over. It's so boring. I saw them last Thursday. I'm now seeing them next week again. That was the most interesting conversation I had all conference from the person I wouldn't have otherwise talked to, right? Easy to do. I know you have the app. Just do it with the app, right? Straightforward. Why not? All of us have settings where we control. If you run a university, many of you are involved in universities. The first week of university president says, here's a meal voucher. I'm going to randomize each incoming student into groups of 4, and you go and eat one dinner with those 4 people that you've never met. Because otherwise what happens is everybody here knows everybody from high school, and then they go to Pompeo or Autonoma, and all their high school friends are already there, but all their high school friends are equally rich as them. So then first week, you're just hanging out with your high school friends. You don't make new friends, particularly you don't make cross-class friends. Use the opportunity to force people to make those friendships. Again, the feedback from this type of mixing is great. People love it. It's interesting. You meet new people. People want to meet new people. It's just hard to do. So the idea is, once you realize social capital matters, there's not just one thing. There's a million small things, and each and every one of us has some lever we can pull. And I find that in many ways so liberating, right? Because it's so easy in many of the countries we're from to look at the dysfunction at the national political level and say, well, we have all these problems, but guarantee you nothing's going to be done about it, right? But here's something that's inherently local. This is not something that needs a national policy change from Madrid or DC or Berlin or London or wherever you may be from. It doesn't need that. Friendships are always local. And so you can form them. You can do what it is that you can do. Okay. So network really matters. And so I just want to end up with a network that's been really important to me. It's a network of my co-authors. Many of them. There's a lot of work to be done. Most of this is never done by single individuals. I want to point out one that I think is particularly meaningful today. Matt Jackson is a co-author I have overlapping with Tony. I think it's the only one I have. But he's been a terrific mentor of mine as well in terms of thinking about networks. Really teaching me some of the theory, though, most of it I still don't fully understand. These networks matter. They matter in everything. And so, I'm, again, really, really grateful for the opportunity to... This truly was lecturing you, wasn't it? Really try and convince you of what I've become convinced of, that something that Tony knew all along, which is the structure of networks is at the heart of everything. And if we ignore that, we can't be a social science, right? It's in the name of social science. We have to look beyond the simple economics. There's so much to be learned by our colleagues in sociology. So much of this, you start going back to, the ethnographic work of, Bob Putnam, who's obviously, a key player in the social capital space, but many other people through the decades in sociology who've done descriptive work that I think is valuable. So I think, I hope some of you are going to leave tonight thinking, I want to work a bit more on networks, and I want to encourage you to do that, even if you cannot find clean, random variation. Because it took us 5 years to get the one causal statement out, 5-6 years, and I don't know how much you can do there. But just because you can't prove causality does not mean it's not right? And so I hope some of you will join me. I hope, if I come back in 10 years, we'll add a few rows to this list, maybe people in this room. I think this is really important work. And I think, Tony really showed us the way. He showed us where this should go. And I think we have a long way to go still. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions and some conversation. Let me just share like a small thought, which is like very often we discuss with PhD students, with colleagues, look at this amazing data set, look at this cool data that this person, this company has. And very often what we don't discuss as much is like the cool questions behind what drives research, right? And I think beyond you using amazing data, it's like you showing us how The questions that we try to answer behind this data, it's really what pushes ideas forward, what makes us learn. So with this small reflection, just I encourage questions from the audience, and I'm sure that there's going to be good interactions. Anyone?
So, very interesting talk. I had two questions for you. One is you talk here about economic connectedness and friendships through Facebook. Could you have a similar kind of theory about political connectedness and how exposed I am to people's views? Here you talk about, actual friendship, but maybe when I open the newspaper and I get diverse views, that's a way of being connected to different people. Yeah. And maybe, as social media and, the way we get the information changes, where that could be another angle to explore. The second question is whether you have looked at how the networks of immigrants change over time, and whether you could use this kind of data to look at the assimilation. Now it's very popular, not to discuss immigration, mass immigration, and so on. Here you're telling us a little bit that the lack of connectedness, if we trust your causal interpretation, can be, can come with bad things. Is this something we should worry about when you think about immigration, or how good we are at helping immigrants assimilate or not? Thank you.
Two great questions, almost like I planted them, because I think they're wonderful opportunities to discuss some of the other things we've done and also where I think this should go. So the first one on other dimensions of connectedness, like this idea of bridging social capital. If you think back to that graph, that little network graph I had, today's talk was about labeling rich and poor, but you're exactly right. We need bridges across all dimensions of society. So we have an earlier paper where we looked at cross-gender networks. We basically produced the same maps in the world to see how much men and women are friends with each other, right? Johan mentioned spatial connectedness, right? How much different cities are connected to each other. In Germany, if Munich isn't connected to Berlin, I start realizing why it's difficult to run, a federal country, right? If people just feel like separate, right? So, we've looked at spatial connectedness. We've looked at gender connectedness with, the same data and so on. We have not yet looked at political connectedness. So that's clearly a super interesting question. One thing we have looked at, to your second question, if we've used the same data to track the social integration of immigrants. So actually just a few weeks ago in the JPE, we published a paper tracking the social integration of Syrian migrants in Germany. Found huge spatial variation. Syrian migrants have 3 times as many friends in German friends in some parts of the country as in others. Used a movers research design to show that it's truly this spatial effect of place. Then we used a different movers design. We said, well, okay, so it's not selection by which migrants go where, but is it just that the Germans in some part of the country just dislike migrants more than in another part of the country? So it's the causal effect of space, but it relates to the Germans who live in that space. So here's something really cool we could do. We could track Germans across space. And we could look at when a German moves from a place where on average immigrants don't have many friends to a place where on average immigrants have more friends. The rate of befriending immigrants of that German moves 1-for-1 from origin to destination, and the same for the other way. So that's really encouraging because it tells you it's not that in some parts of the country people are inherently more anti-immigrant than in others. It tells you that there's something about the equilibrium outcome in these places that's driving that. And so then we looked at what that might be, and I think one thing we found is that the availability of things like integration courses really matters. And I always thought of these integration courses as gimmicks, right? You show up, there's a little bit of a language component, but, you're not going to learn German in 40 hours. There's a little bit of here's the laws, here's, some customs, and you leave. That matters. That shifts the equilibrium. And again, we had a causal research design for that, right? So you're exactly right. You can use this to figure out what type of integration policies. I don't use the word assimilation. It is not that they have to become like Germans. We don't also observe assimilation per se. We measured social integration as, just how many German friends you have. We have a separate measure, it's just how well you speak German, again, by the content you interact with. That tracks 1-for-1 with how many German friends you have.
Other questions?
I have seen that among your co-authors there is somebody that came from Barcelona, and he was from the Canary Islands. So that's quite a change, and that was because of a professional network. So have you explored the role of professional networks? Doctors relate to doctors, economists to economists?
Yeah, no, Eduardo Davila, you must be referring to. He's a big fan of the Canary Island. Pitches me on them at I'm one of the few Germans who hasn't been to the Canary Islands. Yes, so we've tried to look at professional networks. I think the data we have, is particularly suited to friendship networks, because I think, for all its flaws, Facebook networks are a good representation of your real-world friendship networks. If I got LinkedIn data, I would be studying professional networks with that. It's just I've not been able to convince them to collaborate with us at the same level as Meta has been willing to do. But you're exactly right. Professional networks matter too, and you'd have to go to a slightly different data set to make progress.
I have a question regarding how or the identification of the language dimension, because you mentioned you used interactions with material posts that are in a particular language, but I see more and more, you can just click and you get translated.
Yeah.
So you think like AI and the fact that in a sense I can go through social media in the language that I want could be shifting that dimension? Is it a challenge for the future? Have you seen changes on that?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there's like several parts of this. One of it is it going to lead to an additional measurement challenge down the road for us using this data? Maybe. Though my sense is if there's a Catalan text and you click translate, I can guess you don't speak Catalan, right? So I still think there's information here. There's a broader question, which is, it's an interesting one, my eldest is now, we're starting to discuss with how many foreign languages is it worth learning, right? And, for anyone who doesn't grow up in a place like this where everyone speaks 3 or 4 or 5 languages, it's hard to learn a foreign language, right? And so the question is it worth doing? What are the returns? And one thing that you think about is, some of our Silicon Valley, leaders seem to believe that, a few years from now, in my glasses, I have an auto-translate and we can talk in any language and I hear it and so on. And I suspect that's not that far down the road in terms of practice. Now, then the question becomes, does that lead to more cross-class connections? And I think here, that's actually harder, because I'm going to ask you this and you can reflect on it. To the extent that you see fewer links between the Catalan speakers and the non-Catalan speakers in Barcelona, how much of that is truly a language barrier in the extent that they would not find a language in which they could communicate should they choose to? Or how much of it is cultural? And no, Ray-Ban Meta glasses is going to make that go away, right? My sense is it's much less that you wouldn't find someone. You all speak Spanish too, right? So it's not like you wouldn't find a language to actually talk with each other, right? I think it's something deeper, not something that you can proxy for with the languages you speak. But, it's not going to go away with simultaneous translate.
So I think we have time for just one more question.
Thank you very much for the talk. I grew up in the UAE, actually, so I spent most of the talk contemplating on how stratified that society is. But the question I had is that being there, it's not that rich and poor people don't interact at all. The rich people, they have maids, they have drivers, they have people who work for them. So, and this relates to the use of Facebook friendships as the measure of friendship. What kind of contexts do relationships between rich and poor people lead to economic outcomes in? Because it's not that they don't interact at all, it's just that there's a specific context at least to them developing these effects.
It's a very good question. And there's a part where honestly I don't know. What I can tell you is the data suggests very, very strongly that once the strength of a relationship passes the threshold to become a Facebook friendship, there's probably some continuous measure of friendship, interaction intensity in the background, and there is a threshold, and I'm going to be honest, that threshold's going to be different across countries, right? It's not like, a Facebook friendship means something different in Germany than it means in Colombia, right? That's not a problem to the extent that you're doing most of the analysis, within country and so on. But I think interaction is a continuous, is a continuous metric. And I would hazard to suggest that one of the things that probably matters a lot is the extent of respect in a relationship. And it could well be that on average, even an employer and a cleaner relationship in the UAE and in another country might entail a different level of, respect, mutual respect. I don't know how I would measure that, but I could well imagine that that's kind of a key underlying driver in terms of how, even if it's not on Facebook, is there something that it can help? I mean, there's certainly stories, many of them, where people in some countries, they have a housekeeper. They get to know the housekeeper a lot. And when the housekeeper's kid starts being the age where they apply to college, you might say, hey, have you thought, is your kid going to go to college or not? Like, have you thought about that? Right? That's certainly something I've seen in my own social circle. I suspect that's less common in some other countries. And so even sort of similar relationships, if they are more unequal on power and therefore more unequal on respect most of the time, can work in very different ways, right? That is in some sense a danger of doing a global study, right? It's very powerful on some dimension, and yet local context still matters a lot. I think you can have local context matter a lot and yet believe that global patterns can still be hugely informative.
So thank you very much for this very interesting talk, discussion. Thank you all for coming here and participating from this discussion. And we leave it here.
Go and talk to someone you've not talked to before.